Thank you, Erin. I am so happy to be here, especially talking about float therapy, one of my favorite modalities. So I'm going to share my screen. Give me just a second to get that pulled up here. And all right, so let's talk a little bit. First, a brief introduction. My name is Kim Hannan, and I own Sukino Float Center in Salt Cave. We're located in southern Indiana in the United States, and we offer 3 services at our center. We started with float therapy, then we added halo therapy, and then we added infrared stone therapy using an infrared mat. And we've been open since 2018. And during that time, I have learned so much, and I've loved getting to offer these services to our community. And I also have another business called Mindful Solutions, where I work with other float centers, other salt caves and halotherapy centers, and other wellness providers for marketing and training and things like that. I'm also currently the president of a nonprofit organization, the Float Conference, and every year our goal is to provide resources and to plan an annual industry event. It's a really big conference. We travel to different cities every year, and we have different speakers who come. We have workshops about business. We have workshops about opening a float center. So a lot of really, really amazing activities. It's also one of the ways that I fell in love with the float industry. Another place you can find me is on Art of the Float. It's a podcast, but we also have photography services, financial modelers that are really helpful for getting your business off of the ground, things like that. So, and I have amazing teams that work with me on each of those projects. So it is certainly not me alone, but I love getting to be a part of those organizations serving the industry. So, first up, you might be wondering what floating is. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't, but it goes by several names. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as sensory deprivation. You might hear it as REST, restricted environmental stimulus therapy. It's known as a lot of different things. We don't often hear sensory deprivation as much anymore within the industry, and that's because sometimes that's a bit of a misnomer. What really tends to happen is that people become more aware of their senses. They aren't necessarily being deprived. We remove distractions, but in that process, oftentimes people become more aware of what they see or what they feel or what they hear. You kind of tune in and become a little bit more acute in your awareness. So what is floating? To some degree, it's what you think. You're floating on water, but it's very different than what you do at home in a bathtub or in your pool in the summertime, where basically we have about 10 inches of skin temperature water that is typically around 94-ish degrees Fahrenheit. And we also keep the air at that same temperature. The idea is that when you're floating, you completely lose track of where your body ends and where the water begins. So it's a really amazing sensation. It gives you that weightless feeling. And we add about 800 to 1,400 pounds of pharmaceutical grade magnesium sulfate, Epsom salt, into that 10 inches of water. Usually it's around 200 gallons, but depending on the size of your float tank or vessel, then it could be more or less. But about 5 pounds of salt for 1 gallon of water, just to kind of give you an idea. It is extremely dense solution. It's very silky to touch, but if you dip your hand all the way in and then bring it out and you don't rinse it off, you'll look like you have a white glove within just a few minutes because it is, pretty much that salty in there. Epsom salt, of course, at home is wonderful. A lot of people take baths with Epsom salt and use, a cup or 2 cups. Imagine putting in this much. At my center, we have 1,100 pounds in our float tanks. And so it is extremely salty and there's no effort at all. You're kind of like a cork. You pop up and you float without any kind of effort, any trying. It's a totally weightless sensation. You can have the lights on or off, depending on what type of float tank you have or what you're in. Some places allow you to change the color of the light. Some vessels don't have the lighting option at all, or some centers might put a floating light inside that you can use if you want to. Some places do allow you to have music. Some tanks will even play it automatically or have an auxiliary cord where you can connect a device. And some are super fancy and even have twinkly stars or things like that in the ceiling. So there's a pretty broad range, and I'm going to talk about some specific tank styles in just a minute. But generally speaking, sessions are between, say, 60 to 90 minutes or so. There's been a movement towards shorter ones because, at least in the United States, we Americans are getting really impatient, and we want our relaxation and we want it fast. But 90 minutes has been kind of the standard, and that's what most of the float research has been done. At my center, we offer 75 minutes and 90 minutes. But of course, guests can get out at any point. And so they don't have to stay in. We're not locking them in there. They're in complete control of the entire experience. But you might wonder, why would someone want to float? What's the benefit? And if you ask most float center owners, they're going to tell you floating is for everyone. And to some degree, that is true. There are some cases where there are contraindications, and we don't recommend floating. Things like uncontrolled diabetes, or if you have seizures, things like ear tubes. If you have chronic kidney issues, there could be some cases where it might not be a good idea to float. Of course, we always recommend everyone checks with their healthcare provider before coming in to float. Any kind of health conditions and things need to go through a licensed medical professional rather than us trying to administer any kind of medical advice. But the benefits of float are varied and many. We see athletes coming in for performance recovery. We see tons of folks for stress, for pain relief, for inflammation reduction. People will come in and they are looking for creative inspiration, or they're just trying to clear their head. Some people come in to meditate. It's a wonderful environment for that because there are no distractions. We see a lot of folks for anxiety and depression. There's actually a lot of research on how flotation therapy can help with those conditions. Some float for higher states of consciousness, some to combat sleep issues. There are tons of reasons that people would want to float, and you can find some of the research behind these reasons at a website called clinicalflotation.com. It is loaded with some presentations, there's videos, there's actual clinical studies that are posted. It's just a wealth of information that is out there. This was started by Dr. Justin Feinstein. He used to be with the Leiber Institute, the Laureate Institute for Brain Research. And he is now working on his own project of the Float Research Collective, and will be launching that sometime very, very soon. So check out that website for a lot of information. Now, the different types of float vessels or float tanks that are out there are plenty of options. There are manufacturers internationally. There are several manufacturers here in the United States where I am. And each one has a unique set of features. Benefits. The filtration systems are all very different. And if you are interested in adding float therapy to your location, I recommend checking with your local health department first to see if there are any kind of regulations in place already. That way, you know that when you're shopping for a float tank, that you need to have something that does this, and this specifically, or that you might not have any kind of limitations around that. Just some examples. Some places require that you use bromine. Some places require that you use hydrogen peroxide. Some require UV. There are lots of different filtration options, as well as cleaning and sanitization processes and things that you need to use there. So let's start with the original, the float tank. Whenever you search online for float therapy, you'll probably find a device that looks like this, or maybe a pod that I'll show you in a moment. But this is kind of where it started, and a lot of folks are still using tanks like this. It's typically a lower cost to have a tank like this in your facility, and you can find these even on the secondhand market. Used tanks like this will go anywhere between, say, $3,000 to newer ones up in the $12,000 to $15,000 range. A lot of times tanks like this don't necessarily have lighting or music. They are typically a more purist sort of approach to float therapy, but deliver an amazing, amazing float. You'll notice in the image, there's also what may or may not be obvious to you is a shower. And we'll talk a little bit more about some construction issues here in a little bit, but it is crucial to have a shower in every room as well. You don't want folks to, number one, go somewhere else and then have the opportunity to get dirty again before they make it into the float suite. So they want to shower and step directly in, wet hair and all. That's totally fine, but that removes any bodily fluid, or not bodily fluid, sorry, that removes any kind of body products that they may have used, hair products, deodorants, lotions, oils, all of that sort of stuff. But then when they come back out, you want to get that salt water off of them as quickly as possible. You don't want them to have to like run through the center to go somewhere else to take a shower, if you can avoid that. Another style I mentioned was the pod. And again, tons of variation in the styles of the float pods. These will oftentimes have lights and music as an option. They come in different shapes. Sometimes they look like a clamshell. Sometimes you step in from the side and they kind of open more like a tanning bed booth setup might. There are some gorgeous, gorgeous models that are out there, and these photograph really, really well. So a lot of times, people will see this in their social media feeds, and it just kind of stops them in their tracks. They always look really amazing. Anytime if you're trying to market it. There are also cabins that are available out. The cabins are basically a room that you put inside your room. Oftentimes it's kind of ready-made, and it might have to be constructed, but it looks like something that you can just pick up and move from point A to point B. Sometimes that's not the case. Oops, there we go. But again, you do still want to have a shower in the room. Cabins are wonderful for controlling the air temperature. I mentioned earlier that you try to keep that around 94 degrees Fahrenheit, and that helps to keep that kind of neutral feeling. You don't want to feel warm, but you certainly don't want to feel cold. So trying to find that like middle ground of being neutral. Cabins often will have a great heating system that helps the air to circulate, but also keep it warm. There are also some cabins that can look more like they're built in. This is what I have at my center, and mine has a glass door. That can also help people to feel a little more comfortable if they have concerns about claustrophobia. But in this case, you get all of the parts in and then drywall around it, or maybe you have other materials that you want to use, sometimes things like mermaid panels or some sort of a fiberglass panel, those sorts of things as well. So lots of different approaches for the aesthetics on this. There's also a growing movement towards using open pools, whether it's a round one like what I've shown here or a square rectangle sort of thing. There are some really awesome manufacturers out there who are creating some beautiful open pools. These are very popular for people who have concerns about claustrophobia. Oftentimes they're more accessible. And most of the research that's been done on float therapy has been done for open float tanks because it really removes a lot of those barriers. These can be quite a bit more expensive, but and they do require some sort of a ceiling radiant heat option. So it requires a little bit more in the construction process to make sure that the room is the right environment, because you don't want to just throw a float tank into any old room. That is definitely not the case. So let's talk a little bit about pricing and packaging. Most float centers will charge somewhere between $60 to $90 US. Most will offer some sort of a discount if you do a multi-pack, like a 3-pack for, intro package for anyone who's new, around $99 to $180 a month, or $99 to $180 for that particular package. Depends on your market. But most places also rely heavily on membership structures, where you get, say, 1 float a month or 2 floats a month, or you can, buy as you go, whatever the case may be. But the membership structures usually around $10 to $20 less per float than the cost of just a single session would be. So lots of different ways to incorporate that. At my center, we have a membership that allows you to use your credits on floating for our salt cave or for our infrared therapy. To get some really great information about this, check out floattanksolutions.com. This team has put together a ton of valuable resources free for anyone who's interested. They also do a workshop that I'll talk about a little bit in a minute, but floattanksolutions.com, you can find state of the industry reports on there. And I'm going to show you a little bit of data from one of those in just a moment. But you can dive into all sorts of detail about the number of float tanks that most centers have, how long their sessions are, what pricing they have, how many employees they have. There's all kinds of really great stuff in there. So I'll tell you more about that in a minute. Let's talk about construction. Float therapy does require some really specific things to be addressed during the construction process. It looks like you just walk in and you have a shower and somewhere to float. And a hook or something for your towel. There's a lot more that goes into it, and it's important that you get it right the first time. Otherwise, it could be extremely expensive to fix on the back end. So we have a lot of salt and it gets everywhere. There are days that we walk in and say, like, how on earth did they get salt on the ceiling? It happens. So you want to make sure that everything that you're using is salt proof. Your paint, your grout, everything needs to be able to handle salt, right down to even the nails and the screws that you're choosing for construction. It is so, so, so important. It needs to be waterproof. A lot of places put drains in the center of the float suite, and that's really helpful. And if you want to just go in there with a hose and hose down the entire room, you can certainly do that. Tile is sometimes a challenge for centers. They're beautiful tiled showers, but oftentimes between the salt and the high frequency of shower usage, it can start to wear down over time. So you might want to consider something other than tile, especially on the floors or in the walls. It needs to be soundproof. We talked earlier about sensory deprivation, and while you don't necessarily need to deprive them, it can be very, very noticeable if someone is floating and all of a sudden somebody walks by and sneezes in the hallway. That noise can travel through and ruin the entire experience, because if you drop into that deep state of relaxation and you're in theta waves, you're resting there, and then boom, something happens. It causes even more stress on your body because you're in such a profoundly deep state of relaxation. You also want things to be light proof, because again, once those lights go out, if there's light coming in from around the door, that's keeping your brain busy. And it's really important that we give the brain as little as possible to focus on. That allows us to drop into that deeper state, to hit theta waves if possible. So making sure that everything is light proof, soundproof, waterproof, salt proof. Very, very important to understand that it is not a turnkey operation. It's a lot more than just putting that shower and a float pod in there. So it can feel a little bit overwhelming trying to figure out what exactly you need to put in there. So we have a ton of great resources available across the industry. I'm going to talk specifically about a couple of them, but I do have a website, a page on my website, mindful.solutions/resources. And you can go there to get information about float therapy and get direct links to everything that I'm about to talk about. So mindful with 2Ls.solutions/resources. And you can find all of this and more, because there's a ton of great stuff out there to help you get started as a float center. I mentioned earlier floattanksolutions.com. I also mentioned the Float Conference, which is an annual event typically near the end of summer, early fall here in the US. And we travel. We do have a virtual component to that sometimes, especially after 2020 and this year for 2021. So you might be able to attend that. You can also catch all of our past talks on YouTube for free. We put them all out there for everyone. So there's two places to get started. On floattanksolutions.com, you're going to find a ton of information. I mentioned the industry report earlier, and I pulled one little slide out of the State of the Industry report. This is from 2020 reflection data, basically, looking at the average price per 60-minute float. There's data there to help you figure out how to price things. You can see that pricing starts, it looks like $50 up to $99 for a single 60-minute float. And of course, there's lots of additional questions about other floats and prices for different durations. But we also have information about how many float tanks does your center have. Some places have just a single tank. Most places that are kind of stay busier have 2 or more. There's a general rule in the industry that you want to have at least 2 in order to be profitable as a standalone float center. And that's primarily because people like to do this in pairs. They like to bring friends. Sometimes they come in groups. And so if you can accommodate multiple people at once, that's an excellent idea. If you have a salt cave and 1 float tank and you have ways that people can switch, do one and then the other, that could also be an effective strategy. But there's so much information on this report that can help you to really get a feel for how to operate, even things like, how much revenue to expect, all of that. We also have a nonprofit association, the FTA, Flotation Tank Association, and on that website, you can find some really amazing information about standards for sanitation. You can find a page that has a list of consultants who can help you get started, whether it's from the marketing perspective, whether it's, actual construction and people who can help guide you through that overall process. There's a ton of amazing information, and the FTA is also starting to work more closely with Dr. Feinstein and the Float Research Collective to start doing some really big projects to help, continue research on flotation therapy. Again, Art of the Float podcast, beautiful photography you can use for all of your marketing needs. There's some old blogs that are available on there. There's a financial modeler that I used when I was opening my center. Really great to help you kind of figure out how many employees do you need, how much are you going to need as you're putting together a business plan. And it is very comprehensive and absolutely a wonderful resource too. There's also a Facebook group called the Float Collective. It does require that you are actively in the process of opening your center. If you're still curious about floating, you might need to wait a little bit to join this group. It is an amazing group that has helped me personally so much as I was getting started, but that's another place that you might want to go. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email, kim@mindful.solutions. I love talking about this stuff. I'm happy to help answer any questions you may have or help point you in the right direction if you need some assistance. And there's an organization out there that can help you with that. I mentioned earlier the Start a Center workshop that is hosted at the Float Conference every year. That's hosted by the Float Tank Solutions team. And they go beginning to end, like all of the tricks to make sure that your space is salt-proof, waterproof, light-proof, and soundproof. And the construction piece of it is one of those, again, I'm going to reiterate, that is so, so, so important. They have some amazing tips and tricks. They have complete construction packages available, but they also have some, resources that are available for free that can help you to get started on that planning process. So I personally love floating. It has been life-changing for me. And if you've floated before, I'm sure you can relate to some degree at least. And if you haven't tried floating, I highly recommend giving it a whirl. Look around, see if there's some places near you. And if you're not sure and you can't find anything with a quick internet search, send me a message and I'm happy to help try to put you in touch with whatever might be the closest center to you, if that's an option. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your conference. Thanks so much for having me today.